Welcome, everyone. This morning, we have the honor of having as keynote speaker by Haley Andreozzi and Emma Tutein. Haley is a wildlife biologist and educator and a wildlife conservation state specialist with the University of New Hampshire's Cooperative Extension. Haley works with volunteers, landowners, natural resource professionals, and communities to enhance, restore, and conserve wildlife and habitat throughout New Hampshire. She provides technical assistance for outreach, for citizen science and stewardship projects related to New Hampshire's wildlife species, including bats, butterflies, New England cottontail rabbits, and other species of greatest conservation need. Haley's also involved with Taking Action for Wildlife, which is a program that supports community-based efforts related to wildlife conservation, and also with Women in the Woods program, which supports women forest land owners and stewards with educational programming and resources. She has participated in White Pine Program's Tracking Apprenticeship in 2016 and integrates track and sign into her work. Emma is also here and is joining us as an educator and with a lot of expertise in land conservation and wildlife. She is the Community Conservation State Specialist with UNH Cooperative Extension and also works closely with conservation professionals, communities, and volunteers throughout New Hampshire. She provides support to the New Hampshire Land Trust Coalition and helps to coordinate New Hampshire's annual statewide land conservation conference. Emma has also participated in White Pine Program's Tracking Apprenticeship and recently earned her Track and Sign Professional in 2021. So please join me in welcoming them both for our keynote speaker this morning, or our keynote speaker.
I'm going to do airplane mode before I do anything else. So all right. All right, everyone can hear us okay? We're going to share the mic a little bit, so if at any point it's not loud enough, just let us know. Oh, good morning. We want to start by thanking you all for having us here. We feel pretty honored to have been asked, and we really respect the amount of wisdom, experience, knowledge, and general enthusiasm that's in this room this morning. But if we're being honest, when we were first asked to give this talk, our immediate response was, why us? And Amy and others can vouch for that. And not in a completely self-deprecating way, but the reality is that many of you in this room spend way more time or have dived way deeper into wildlife tracking than we have.
So as we grappled with that question, we discussed it with Amy, we talked with colleagues, we talked with our spouses, and through all those conversations, Haley and I realized that we have a shared vision for the future. Very broadly speaking, this vision is just to connect people with nature. But more practically, and as it relates more specifically to our professional work, we envision a future in which people are using their skills and knowledge, in this case, wildlife track and sign, to make informed decisions on their land and in their communities. So today we're going to share with you a little bit about who we are, what we do, why we do it, and more about our hopes for the future. And we're going to start by introducing ourselves, more than Kelly just did. I'm Emma Tutein. I was born and raised in New Jersey, and despite being the most densely populated state in the country, I grew up on a farm. It is the Garden State after all, there are farms in New Jersey. And I spent a lot of time outside, mostly catching frogs, but also just playing in the woods and having fun. I went to Rutgers University, where I thought I wanted to major in biology without really knowing what I wanted to do with that. But I found myself surrounded by people in those classes who were interested in working in labs or being pharmacists or doctors, and that just did not feel like the right fit for me. And so one day, I was perusing the course catalog, which at the time was actually a literal, big, huge book. Yeah. And I came across a class that the required textbooks for the class were field guides. And I remember very distinctly, like, sort of hearing those, like, breaks in my head, like, wait a minute, there's a class that requires field guides as the textbooks? So I skimmed up the page, what class is this? It was vertebrate biology. So I, like, flipped back a couple pages, what major requires vertebrate biology as a class? And that's how I decided what I was going to do and what I was going to major in. So I changed majors, and I ended up with a bachelor's degree in ecology and natural resource management. While I was at Rutgers, I also took a class that was the field ecology of Alaska, and that led me to spend 4 summers working for the U.S. Forest Service in Alaska during and after college, primarily as a naturalist educator. And that class and that subsequent work experience really laid the groundwork for my future in more ways than I might have imagined. After my time in Alaska, I came to the University of New Hampshire for grad school, where I got my master's degree studying vernal pool amphibians, so I still got to catch frogs in the woods. And while I loved doing field work, I realized pretty quickly that research was not my passion. It didn't drive me, and I knew I wasn't interested in going on to pursue a PhD. So as I was finishing up my degree, luckily, a job opportunity opened up at UNH Extension, and for a wildlife program coordinator position. And so as I applied for that job and prepared for the interview, I learned more and more about cooperative extension and the work that they do. And I realized that extension might be the perfect place for me to combine the things I did love about science, research, and academia, and the things I loved about teaching and working directly with people. Thankfully, I got that job back in 2009, believe it or not, and I've been at Extension ever since, so hard to believe it's been 15 years, but I'm still here.
And I'm Haley Andreozzi. I was born and raised in Rhode Island, and despite growing up in the second most densely populated state in the country, I was always drawn to nature. So if there was one single tree outside, I was climbing it. I was always exploring the rocky coastline outside my parents' back door. And it didn't hurt that I also spent my summers at a camp in New Hampshire, where I was really able to grow that love for the natural world. So I always knew that I wanted to do something to benefit the environment. I just didn't know what that was, and it was mostly because I didn't know what the options were. And so in my 6th grade yearbook, where other kids shared their enthusiasm for a future as a ballerina or a baseball player, my yearbook proudly stated that I wanted to be an environmental lawyer when I grew up. Purely because it was the only profession I had ever heard of that somehow benefited nature or the environment. And also, it probably didn't hurt that I was very good at arguing and making my point known. I went to undergrad at the University of Rhode Island, where I studied environmental science and natural resources management, and despite having that relatively broad undergraduate degree, I continually found myself drawn towards research experiences, internships, and seasonal jobs that focused on wildlife. I spent the summer studying small mammals and bats in Costa Rica. I researched brook trout habitat in southern New England, and I spent a year learning and exploring in Juneau, Alaska, so we have that in common as well. But I was also drawn to opportunities that allowed me to share the natural world with others. Things like running an environmental education program for a summer camp, or leading guided kayak paddles and hikes, or developing outdoor learning experiences for elementary students. Following college, I worked a variety of jobs, everything from environmental consulting to ecology-based curriculum development. And ultimately, I went back to graduate school, and I studied moose ecology and habitat in northern New England. After grad school, I really felt like I wanted to find something that combined my passion for wildlife with my interest in educating others. I spent some time in formal education, which wasn't for me, before starting at UNH Cooperative Extension in 2014, and I've been with the organization ever since.
So while the roads we took to get here are slightly different, though every time I hear that I'm like, there's a lot of similarities too, but we now have even more in common. We are colleagues. I'm the state specialist in community conservation at UNH Cooperative Extension, and I support the professionals and volunteers who do on-the-ground conservation work in New Hampshire, and I also help build public support for land conservation in New Hampshire.
And I'm the state specialist in wildlife conservation at UNH Cooperative Extension. So I work on landscape scale initiatives to help enhance, restore, and conserve wildlife populations and their habitats in the state. We are both educators. While Emma and I are both trained wildlife biologists, the majority of our work involves providing research-based information, education, and training on a variety of topics related to wildlife ecology, habitat management, and land conservation.
We work to educate a variety of audiences, including private landowners, conservation volunteers, municipal officials, conservation organization staff, and natural resource professionals. Some of this learning happens in the classroom, but a lot of it happens out in the field as well. We are conservationists. Our backgrounds, education, and training, as well as our personal philosophies and beliefs, have led us to professions focused on conserving natural resources.
For both of us, our work is really about empowering people with the information and resources that they need in order to inform their decision making about New Hampshire's wildlife and forests and communities. We're also friends. We've worked together for over a decade, and based on what you've heard to be some of our common interests, as well as a lot of mutual respect, we've built a really lovely friendship over the years. We're both also mothers. I'm raising two extremely curious, adventurous, very often muddy or wet naturalists in training. Theo on the left there is 4.5. He is obsessed with toads and snakes, but also drawing and art. Otis in the middle there is 2, doing a birthday dunk on his 2nd birthday this year. And he loves caterpillars, like obsessed with caterpillars, or caterpillars as he calls them, but also turtles and tractors.
And I am raising a strong-willed, sensitive, curious daughter, Olivia, who's on the right here. She's 6 years old, and she loves finding mushrooms and scat in the woods, but also loves looking for fairies and unicorns, too. And we are both track and sign enthusiasts. Both of us have pursued many learning opportunities in tracking over the years, including we both, in different years, attended the White Pine Program's tracking apprenticeship. We've also participated in workshops and certifications, and just spend a lot of time tracking by ourselves, together, and with others. Professionally, we don't really get to work directly with wildlife, and so tracking really helps us keep a connection in our work to the wildlife that we care so much about. And despite seeing increased diversity, even since we started our careers, our sector of natural resources continues to be a predominantly male-dominated field. And so building our expertise in tracking has been really empowering as women in a male-dominated profession. And this is probably part of why we like working on it together so much. We're really building our skills and credibility as 2 women conservation professionals. So, personally, for both of us, tracking provides us with a sense of place to the places we live and the communities and ecosystems in which we work. And it provides a strong connection to wildlife and nature for us and our families.
All right. The personal scary part is over. Okay. So as our skills in and appreciation for wildlife tracking has grown over the years, we have continued to identify opportunities to incorporate it into our work as extension specialists and educators. And it's become a really valuable tool in our efforts to support both community-based land conservation and wildlife habitat conservation in New Hampshire. Our own expertise is in outreach and education around these topics, and so the role that we can play is as a teacher or a facilitator, really supporting others in growing their awareness, their knowledge, and their skills related to wildlife track and sign. Over the past 10 years, we have developed and implemented over 40 workshops and programs focused on wildlife track and sign, involving almost 3,000 participants. This has included mostly field-based trainings, but also virtual sessions and even Facebook Live events for a variety of audiences. The photo you see here is actually from the first wildlife tracking training we offered through UNH Extension. It was for our own staff back in 2014 in partnership with White Pine Programs. You'll see some familiar faces in the room there. Over the years, we've continued to provide track and sign training for our own UNH Cooperative Extension Natural Resources team. This group includes foresters, coastal ecologists, hydrologists, and others who are regularly working to provide technical assistance and education to people and communities all over New Hampshire to help them make decisions about their natural resources. We've also provided training to private landowners and natural resources volunteers. Not unlike other states in New England, New Hampshire is more than 70% privately owned. So over 70% of the forests and habitats in New Hampshire are in private ownership. And that means that the decisions of those landowners has a significant and direct impact on our natural resources. So it's an audience that we deem really important to have education around these topics. And natural resources volunteers play an important role in habitat management and also conservation decision making when they're working with communities and conservation organizations all over the state. So empowering these audiences to observe, to collect information on track and sign, really helps to ensure that wildlife considerations are part of the decision making that happens on those lands. And we've also provided track and sign training to the professionals like consulting foresters, wetland scientists, and wildlife biologists that work to support those private landowners in their management planning, as well as play a role in the management of public and conserved lands all over the state.
Many of our trainings have been for what we often refer to as the general public. These programs are offered and promoted broadly to anyone who is just curious and wants to learn more about what they're seeing on their walks in the woods. For this audience, attending a wildlife tracking workshop might be the hook to get them excited about and more involved in conservation on their own land or in their own communities. Each year, we also provide guest lectures and field-based labs related to wildlife tracking for a number of UNH college courses, including inventorying and monitoring ecological communities and their wildlife capstone course. Typically, university wildlife programs don't include wildlife track and sign in their curriculums, so we really feel strongly that connecting this audience with wildlife track and sign ensures that future wildlife professionals and researchers are aware of the value of track and sign as a tool in their future work.
In addition to organizing our own track and sign trainings and programs, we also work to support other organizations for their programs. For many years, I've collaborated with my colleagues at New Hampshire Fish and Game Department on their Becoming an Outdoors Woman program, where we lead an introductory session on wildlife tracking and snowshoeing at their winter workshop. This program provides women with skills-based training to participate in outdoor activities, and it's based on research that indicates that women prefer to learn these skills, these outdoor skills, in what they would consider a non-competitive environment along other women. For many women that attend, this is their first time on snowshoes, and it's their first opportunity to practice a skill outdoors, which can be a really empowering and inspiring experience for them as participants, but also for us who get to watch it happen every year. We've also offered track and sign training through a women-focused program that we have at Extension called Women in the Woods, and that program's aimed at connecting women forest landowners and stewards with the resources, information, and community that they need in order to make decisions that promote healthy forests and habitats on their properties. As part of that effort, we hold individual wildlife track and sign trainings, but we've also incorporated track and sign into our annual Women Landowner Summit, where hundreds of women from across the state get together and learn skills and build community.
So these workshops are held on a diverse array of properties all across the state, as you can see on this map here, but typically they do take place on conserved land. And this exploration of wildlife on protected properties really helps expose people to these special places, but also highlights the value of conservation land. Many participants then go on to practice their new tracking skills on conserved lands in their own communities. Sorry, one more slide for me. To build on our introductory level tracking programs, in the last couple of years, we've also partnered with Daniel Hanchy from Spur Wander to offer more specialized trainings and one-day certifications. And this provides our former workshop participants with the opportunity to build on their skills and knowledge, and it also meets the need for higher level wildlife-focused professional development opportunities, which are not really regularly offered in New Hampshire.
Beyond these trainings and workshops, we've also incorporated wildlife track and sign into other aspects of our work. A growing focus of mine in the last decade or so has been on participatory science related to wildlife and habitats, working with state agencies and researchers to involve members of the public in research and monitoring efforts. One example is a citizen science project that I coordinated with New Hampshire Fish and Game Department for many years to involve volunteers in collecting data on the distribution of cottontail rabbits in the state. For those of you who aren't familiar, the presence of either the native state endangered New England cottontail rabbit or the introduced, much more abundant eastern cottontail rabbit on any given property can really only be determined and confirmed through DNA analysis of their fecal pellets. So there's a real need for rabbit poop across the landscape. So volunteers were trained to identify rabbit tracks and sign to determine if rabbits were present on a property in order to be able to collect pellets from all over southern New Hampshire. This effort helped us understand more about the distribution and potential range expansion of those eastern cottontails, understand more about what that would mean for New England cottontails, this native threatened population, as well as identify locations of New England cottontails that were otherwise unknown. And that information helps us make decisions about how to best manage these species and their habitats. Tracking also plays a role in many other participatory science efforts that we're involved with around bats, butterflies, reptiles and amphibians, and more.
We also regularly include wildlife track and sign information into our other outreach and engagement efforts. We might, when we do that, we're using it maybe as like a hook to share a specific message that we want to get across. So for example, when we wanted to bring attention to species of greatest conservation need in New Hampshire, I wrote a blog post about using track and sign to identify those specific species. Or when promoting Trail Finder, which is another completely different project of my work, which is a website that makes it easy to find trails in New Hampshire and Vermont. I wrote an article about looking for wildlife sign on snowy trails, and then in those posts it links to trails that might be good to find that sign. So we definitely use it as a tool to grab people other ways as well. And depending on how broadly you define tracking, if you include camera trapping and wildlife sightings, for instance, it touches almost every aspect of our work in some way or other. As part of our Taking Action for Wildlife program, which works to implement the New Hampshire State Wildlife Action Plan, we provide direct technical assistance to New Hampshire communities, primarily through their town conservation commissions, to help them achieve their goals and objectives related to wildlife. Often, this involves helping them identify what wildlife species are present in their community or on the town lands that they own and manage.
All right, so that's an overview of how we integrate track and sign into our work, but the next question is why? Why do we incorporate tracking into our land and wildlife conservation efforts? So we're going to spend some time now sharing why we think that this is effective and some specific examples of how track and sign can lead to on-the-ground conservation. When I was younger, I had this idealized fantasy of being a wildlife biologist. I thought I would be running through the woods every day, tracking turtles or, tracking bears, really up close and personal with the species that I felt so passionate about. But as I got older and I progressed in my education and I had some real life on-the-ground experience under my belt, I realized that while conservation is about natural resources, of course, it's equally about people, their beliefs, and their values. In order to make a difference for these resources, we have to reach the people that are responsible for managing and conserving them. And for that reason, I've come to feel that education and outreach is one of the most valuable tools we have in conservation. Our role as extension educators is to provide research-based information and resources to the people and communities of New Hampshire so that they can make informed decisions on their land and in their communities. It is not our goal to tell people what to do or to persuade them to take specific actions. Instead, we work to provide them with the tools, the information, and the skills that they need to make their own decisions based on their unique goals and objectives. And I strongly believe in this approach. But from a personal perspective, as someone who cares deeply about wildlife and the natural world, my hope is that being exposed to this information and learning about these resources and building these skills will inspire appreciation and care for these resources. There's a quote from Baba Diom, who was a Senegalese forestry engineer, that many of you have likely heard, but for good reason, because it's a good one. In the end, we will conserve only what we love will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. Yeah, right? Preach. People who understand more about the natural world are more likely to take action to protect it. We know this based on our experience in the world, but research has also shown that connection to nature promotes pro-environmental behavior.
So using wildlife track and sign as an outreach tool in our conservation efforts aligns with what we know about how people learn. In our case, specifically how adults learn. So while we do work with kids on occasion, our work is mostly focused on the adults who are currently responsible for managing and conserving wildlife and other natural resources in New Hampshire. Many of you are likely familiar with the term pedagogy, which is the method and practice of teaching to children. But you might not be as familiar with the term andragogy, which is also a little harder to get off the tongue, which is the method and practice of teaching to adults. There's a ton of research and information out there about adult learning theory, how to effectively teach adult learners who have lived life, have their own experiences, and have unique motivations for learning. And wildlife tracking lends itself extremely well to how we know adults learn. So adults learn by doing, which makes the hands-on, often field-based nature of wildlife tracking a really effective tool for learning. Adults desire relevance. They are more likely to engage in learning if what they are learning has some relevance to their own lives. So teaching them about the evidence of wildlife that they might see in their own backyards or on their own outdoor adventures provides a sense of connection that's really important for their learning. Adult learning principles also recognize that adults utilize their own experiences. They're shaped by their experiences and are more likely to learn when they can build on their existing knowledge. And adults process with their senses. Most adult learners do not thrive as well in lecture-style environments and require fully engaging their senses to solidify new knowledge.
As we lecture to you.
Yeah, I had the same thought pass through my head, but I'm like, but then we're gonna go outside. So, but wildlife tracking science speaks to all of these principles of adult learning and more. So we see the effectiveness with adults that attend our programs. We surveyed the participants from our wildlife tracking workshops over the last 7 years, and 96% of them indicated that the workshop increased their knowledge of track and sign, and 96% of them also felt more confident in identifying wildlife track and sign as a result of their participation in the workshop. So in simple terms, we often refer to wildlife tracking as sticky. It's a way of teaching that's really easily remembered, so it really sticks with people.
Another effective aspect of incorporating track and sign into our outreach efforts is that it gives people a tool that they can then share with others. A fancy term for this, an extension of course, is called peer-to-peer learning. It's a commonly used approach in natural resources extension, and it involves landowners and community members sharing their knowledge and experience with one another. And that's because research has shown that individuals are most likely to change their behavior on their land, for instance, if they have contact with a knowledgeable peer. That could be a trusted friend, a neighbor, or a family member. Those knowledgeable peers have more influence than publications, than a television program, even than contact with a natural resources professional. So providing program participants with education around track and sign not only enhances their understanding of nature in New Hampshire, but hopefully also reaches those that they choose to share it with, their neighbors, their fellow community members. In that survey of program participants, 91% indicated that they shared their knowledge about track and sign with others. Beyond its benefits as an educational tool, wildlife tracking also provides what Emma and I would consider to be the foundational components of effective land and wildlife conservation. And that's both data-driven decision-making and community involvement. Wildlife tracking provides useful data that helps us understand where certain wildlife species are found, what habitat features they're using, and how they're moving across the landscape. And this means that conservation and management decisions can be made using information on actual species distribution and actual habitat use. Track and sign can help to inform management strategies and also help to prioritize protection areas for the landowners, the organizations, and the communities that we work with. And that information is collected by people. Ideally, it's collected by the people, the landowners, or the groups that are involved in that decision-making. We've seen many examples of this, but we wanted to share a few of these stories with you today of how wildlife track and sign can and has played a role in land and wildlife conservation in New Hampshire. This is James Kibler. He moved to New Hampshire in 2016 to the town of Hampton Falls. Is anyone familiar? No. Very tiny little town, small community in the seacoast region of the state. Parcels are extremely small, development pressure is extremely high, and the population density there is continually increasing. Being an avid outdoorsman, he moved to the state and immediately started looking for ways to get involved with natural resources and conservation volunteering here in New England. He began attending some of Extension's wildlife-focused workshops, including his very first exposure to wildlife track and sign at a training that we ran in partnership with White Pride programs in 2017. This experience helped to ignite a real interest in learning more about the wildlife found in his community, particularly in his little 3-acre backyard. Over the next few years, James taught himself how to photograph wildlife. He set up trail cameras to inventory species coming and going, and he continued to build his skills in tracking. He shared this enthusiasm with his community, both by joining his town's conservation commission, as well as writing a column focused on what he was observing in his backyard in Hampton Falls magazine. And he shared it with me by regularly sending me scat mysteries and tracking puzzles to discuss, which I welcome gladly. In 2020, a 30-acre parcel next to his home came on the market. And in a few years that he'd been tracking wildlife, James had inventoried a broad diversity of wildlife species, not just on his property, but also on this neighboring parcel, finding evidence of fisher, ermine, mink, river otters, bobcats, red fox, coyotes, raccoons, porcupines, deer, beaver, even moose, and this small little pocket of seacoast New Hampshire, and more. Having that information helped James to recognize the value of this place for wildlife in a highly developed landscape. He and his wife bought the parcel and worked with the town of Hampton Falls and the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests to put a conservation easement on what is now Clay Brook Forest. I know, I have goosebumps. I know this story and I have goosebumps every time. It's permanently protected from future development. It provides valuable wildlife habitat, and it's a place where community members can visit to experience nature. James's story demonstrates how education and wildlife track and sign can inspire people to learn more about, manage, and conserve important places in their community. And it's also an example of how tracking can help provide concrete, useful information on where conservation efforts can have a significant impact for wildlife.
So the examples of how our work might influence conservation efforts are not always as linear as James's example, which is just one of the best stories. It's just not always possible to draw a direct line from our efforts, our work, to the outcomes. But we hope through the diversity of the work that we do and the different ways that we reach people that maybe we're just the pebble falling into the water that start those ripples moving out across the pond into something bigger. So here are two maybe less linear examples, but hopefully I'll tell them in a somewhat linear way, of how our work might provide the spark of inspiration for people to use wildlife tracking as a tool to support their conservation work. So back in 2020, we worked with partners to provide 2 introductory webinars on protecting wildlife corridors based on a newly released report called Connect the Coast, which provided maps that modeled important wildlife corridors throughout New Hampshire's coastal watershed. The webinar included suggestions for towns to ground truth the maps with local data using tools like tracking, cameras, and wildlife observations. So 2 representatives from the town of Exeter, New Hampshire, their natural resources planner, Kristen Murphy, and a conservation commissioner, Carlos Quindon, attended one of these introductory webinars online. Inspired by what they learned and with their new wildlife tracking, the wildlife corridor maps in hand, they sought to collect some of that on-the-ground data to ground truth the map in their community. And they did this in part by setting up several camera traps at 2 different road crossings along the Bloody Brook, where they wanted to determine the impacts of some existing highway fencing on wildlife movement through those road crossings. So as you can see here, some of the photos they captured with those camera traps of bobcat, deer, and raccoons, and I know they caught many other species using these road crossings as well. And I just circled back with Kristen recently to find out sort of what came of this project, and she really excitedly shared with me that as a result of what they found with these camera traps, they worked with the New Hampshire Department of Transportation to remove some of the fencing, and that has in turn significantly improved wildlife movement through these corridors. Okay, and having a better understanding of how wildlife were using this Bloody Brook corridor also led the Conservation Commission to identify some new parcels as important priorities for land conservation to help connect this area to existing protected land. So maybe someday in the future they'll have luck conserving those properties as well. And I'll also add that they have shared this story with others in a variety of ways, including a blog post on our Taking Action for Wildlife website, and they're also going to be featured in a video being produced by the Nature Conservancy of New Hampshire, who is responsible for creating the Connect to Protect those wildlife corridor maps. One last example I want to share is from quite a while ago. It's back when I took the wildlife tracking apprenticeship a little over 10 years ago with White Pine Programs. And at that time, I was also a board member on our local land trust, Southeast Land Trust of New Hampshire. And this property that you can see here, outlined in orange, we don't have a laser pointer, but that's okay, is the Kelleher Memorial Forest. And it was protected while I was on the board. And I'll just orient you a little bit to the property. So it had some pretty neat features, including this, these beaver ponds that have open water, but then you can also kind of see where the texture of this photo changes a little. This is a corner of what is called Spruce Swamp, and it's actually the largest freshwater wetland in Rockingham County, so in southeastern New Hampshire, and it's a really significant wetland complex. And this little narrow point here has a beaver dam on it, and that is key to the story here. So just wanted to sort of orient you to what you're looking at. So they had a volunteer who lived next to this property, and she had, just of her own interest and with permission, set up camera traps along that beaver dam and in a couple other places. And at that beaver dam, she captured just some amazing videos of wildlife, which she shared with the Land Trust. So inspired by her videos, I decided that for my tracking apprenticeship project, I would spend a winter doing some wildlife tracking on this property for CELT, as they were just in the early phases of deciding how they were going to manage this property, both in where they would be putting trails on the property, which is what this pink line is showing what was originally proposed to be the trail, and they were also planning a timber harvest. So I spent a winter out on the property, visiting several times. I recorded and mapped the trails and tracks and sign of moose, deer, bobcat, coyote, porcupine, fisher, mink, snowshoe hare, turkeys, and beavers on the property. I shared that spatial data with CELT and some specific recommendations, and they used that information to inform their management, and it actually changed what they were planning to do on the property. So they were planning to do a timber harvest that would just sort of harvest trees uniformly across the property, but through my efforts I identified an area of a dense hemlock stand that had heavy deer use in the winter and other wildlife too. And so I encouraged them to leave that area untouched during the timber harvest, and they did, which was great. And then also, based on what I found and the information that this volunteer had collected with her camera traps, we really identified that spit of land and that beaver dam as being really important for wildlife movement across this property. And so the final trail map actually eliminated that little loop of the trail that went down that spit, so keeping people out of that part of the property. So this is a really cool example of how on-the-ground wildlife track and sign, and done, pretty informally, really helped inform some actual on-the-ground management that happened on a land trust property.
Okay, so we've shared a lot about our past and current work, but it keeps evolving, so where do we go from here? Emma and I often think or daydream or talk over a beer about how we can deepen our use of track and sign in our work, mostly selfishly because it's something that we love to do, and we have some ideas. One of those thoughts is to create an online or digital mapping tool that helps landowners, conservation organizations, and communities make sense of the wildlife data that they collect using track and sign and camera traps. Ideally, this tool could help users ground truth identify wildlife corridors, inform management decisions, and help communities identify conservation priorities. We've also thought about ways that tracking can be used in future participatory science efforts. For instance, we see real opportunity to have trained tracking volunteers that we can partner with conservation organizations and researchers that would benefit from tracking data and information. But it's not just about our work. There's a lot that you can do.
So Roger Lacandro was the professor who taught that Ecology of Alaska class that I mentioned way back at the beginning of this talk. He was one of those professors who had many sayings or isms that have stuck with his students carrying forward, and he's here with me in Alaska on the left back in college. That feels like a really long time ago, but then also just last year in his home in New Jersey. I still keep in touch with him. And so one thing he really said quite often that has really stuck with me, and I'm really terrible at impressions, but he would always say, "The lesson isn't over until you share it with someone else." And I don't think I really felt the full power of what that meant when he shared it way back then, but it's something I keep coming back to and feels like a driving theme in much of my professional work as an educator. Sharing the things we are passionate about with others is not only the most rewarding and fulfilling part of my work, or both of our work, but it's arguably the most impactful part of our work as well. Haley and I often reflect that teaching tracking makes us better trackers. So again, sharing what we learn completes the lesson for ourselves. Figuring out how to effectively explain things, finding tracks and sign to share with people and discuss, and hearing the questions from participants all help build our own skills and knowledge. And it doesn't just improve our own learning. When we share the things we are passionate about with others, they are more likely to share it with people they know, as we saw in the data from our own tracking workshops. So we can see the ripple effects of that work as people we teach go on to teach others, and so on and so on. You are all here because you share this love and passion for wildlife tracking. So we want to ask all of you to share that passion with others. You might feel like we did when we were asked to give this talk and we wondered, why us? You might be thinking, I don't know enough to share with other people, or what do I have to share that's different or new? But you all bring your own unique perspective and experience to wildlife tracking, and you know more than you think you do. Haley and I have held many track and sign workshops where the tracking conditions were less than ideal, like winter wildlife tracking workshops where it's actively snowing with like 2 inches of fresh powder on the ground and not a single track in sight. And somehow we're always amazed at how much we still find to talk about. So even when it's not clear, we all know more than we think we do. And the sharing that we're asking you to do can look like many different things. It could be workshops like Haley and I lead, but it could also be just taking a walk in the woods with your kids or grandkids or your friends, sharing a cool nature find with a neighbor, writing an article about your experiences, sharing your art, or even just posting cool photos to Instagram. It doesn't matter how you share. Find your unique perspective and lean into that. Just share, and we promise it will make a difference both within you and beyond.
Emma and I usually start our track and sign workshops by sharing the 3 perspectives approach to tracking, which is used by many trackers, many of you in the room, I'm sure, and you can see it outlined here in the first edition of Mammal Tracks and Sign by Mark Elbrock. But for those of you who might be unfamiliar, the 3 perspectives, lying, standing, and flying, force us to look carefully at all the information surrounding every track and sign, by first taking a close, intimate look at the track itself, followed by the trail and the context surrounding it, and lastly, a bird's eye view perspective of the larger ecological context within which the track or sign sits. And as we worked on this talk, these 3 perspectives kept coming up for us as a metaphor for our work and the work all of you might do now and in the future. All of our individual contributions, all the different ways that we share our passion for wildlife tracking are the tracks that together create a trail. Something we can follow and explore to learn more about ourselves, each other, and the world around us. And when you zoom out, you can see how all of those trails interconnect and add up to an incredible amount of activity and impact across the landscape. We want to thank you for your time this morning, and we're really looking forward to connecting with many of you over the course of the next couple of days and learning from you all.